The WA Parliament is debating the legislation on euthanasia, or so-called voluntary assisted dying. Now, so far, the McGowan government bill has passed the lower house and it's now being debated in the state's upper house. Nick Goiran is a Liberal MP in the upper house in WA and he's the lead speaker on the bill for the opposition. In a speech he gave to Parliament this week, Nick Goiran asked, is it possible to design and implement a safe euthanasia regime? He joins me now. Nick Goiran, good evening and welcome to the front page.
Great to be with you, Jane.
Is it possible to have a safe euthanasia regime?
Jane, it is a legal impossibility to create a safe euthanasia regime. We know this because of medical negligence law. We know this from the lessons in contract law. We know this because of doctor bias. And we know this because of what's happened in the other jurisdictions around the world.
Well, look, speaking of other jurisdictions around the world, could we see a further euthanasia, weakening of euthanasia laws? Because already we're seeing that the West Australian law is quite diluted compared to the Victorian law. Could we see further weakening as it progresses around states and territories around Australia?
Well, as you've identified, that's already happening. So in Victoria, they have I believe, a dangerous system of euthanasia, but the West Australian law is more dangerous, particularly because our law will allow for doctor steering, that is for the doctor to be able to suggest the idea of assisted suicide and euthanasia to their patient. That's not allowed in Victoria. No one's been able to explain to me why Western Australians should have a more dangerous system than Victoria. There are other, of course, differences, like the fact that in Victoria a specialist needs to be involved. In Western Australia it will only require the opinion of 2 general practitioners who may have no experience in the underlying condition.
So the doctor can raise it with the patient. And when I think about that, I think about someone lonely and vulnerable in an old people's home and the power imbalance there. So a doctor can raise the idea of euthanasia. You don't have to see a specialist in your condition, just 2 GPs. What, they sign off on it, do they?
That's right. I mean, could we imagine for a moment that a general practitioner feels inadequate, inexperienced to deal with a particular patient, and out of a sense of compassion then says to the person, look, you might want to consider this particular option, completely abandoning the patient, not telling them about specialist referral and treatment that was available to them. And as I say, we've seen this in other jurisdictions. This is a nightmare for Western Australia.
Could you also, if you've got 2 GPs, could one or both of those GPs be the family's GP and therefore have torn allegiances, if you like?
They could, but what's even more dangerous in the West Australian regime is that the medical practitioner doesn't have to have any background and experience with that particular patient. So they may know nothing about the patient's history. Could it be the case that that patient has had a history of depression or a demoralisation that this particular practitioner is unaware of, that in a very speedy consultation decides to sign off on the death of this particular patient? This system is open to abuse.
It's been put to me by palliative care physicians who, everyone I've spoken to is against this legislation. It's been put to me that if you're a family GP, and perhaps the scenario that was put to me is there's a daughter with a couple of children and they've got an ailing parent, and the daughter is perhaps a single mother really struggling, and the GP is the GP of that whole family, that they would have torn allegiances because they think, well, there's an inheritance there. This person, the daughter, for instance, could benefit.
Yeah, well, we know in Western Australia, because I chaired the Select Committee into Elder Abuse, that elder abuse is a particular problem in Western Australia, and one of the reasons for that is that there is this inheritance impatient syndrome that is emerging in Western Australia. This is a real problem. Now, in addition to that, you've got doctors. The doctors who will be involved in this are the doctors who have a bias towards euthanasia and assisted suicide, because they will have to have registered and done some so-called training on this. Now,
what's the training?
Well, that's a question that the Health Minister has failed to answer so far.
Okay, and what were you saying, inheritance syndrome?
Inheritance impatience syndrome, where the particular individuals within the family, they're in a hurry to get their inheritance, and so we discovered that in the elder abuse inquiry, which I chaired. It's a real problem in Western Australia, and this voluntary euthanasia scheme in Western Australia, well, that's really a recipe for elder abuse. It's a very significant concern, and I'm afraid it's not clear to me that the lawmakers in Western Australia are really wrestling with this problem at an intellectual level. They're only dealing with it at an emotional level.
Do you accept, and you've been in government before this current McGowan Labor government, do you accept that successive governments have let the state of Western Australia, and I think we could make the same argument about states and territories right across the nation, but have let down the people of this state in not properly funding palliative care?
Absolutely. After the last time we had a debate on this topic, which was in 2010, I then established the Parliamentary Friends of Palliative Care. I'm a Liberal member. I co-chair it with a Labor member because I was concerned as far back as then about the state of palliative care funding in Western Australia. But let me say this is the first time in Western Australian history that we have a government that's prioritising lethal injections to the community ahead of palliative care. That's the real concern here, is the government saying that they're going to send out people to provide these lethal injections. Why don't they send out people to provide palliative care treatment to the same individuals?
So the government is saying, I think, almost $18 million over 4 years going into palliative care. There's a study involving some palliative care specialists that says that figure needs to be more like $100 million.
Yeah, look, that amount that the government has given is a pittance. Now, people are offended when I say that, but it is a pittance. Yes, of course, the $18 million will be used and will be welcomed by the palliative care sector. Any extra dollar would be. But if we're serious about allowing lethal injections to be sent out into the community in regional Western Australia in circumstances where there is no access to palliative care, that's not giving these people real choice, that's fake choice.
Understandably, a lot of people who support this voluntary assisted dying, or euthanasia as I call it, just don't want a painful, lingering death for either themselves or their loved ones, or they've witnessed it. I see that on Talkback Radio all the time. People will ring in and say, my mother died this horrible, agonising death. They don't seem to understand, and I feel that the message has not cut through, that that's what palliative care does. What have you found in consulting with your electorate?
Look, the reality is, for all of us in Western Australia, that we have limited medical experience and knowledge. We're not experts in this field. The experts in this field are the palliative care specialists. Now, they're the ones who tell us that at end of life, they are able to look after a person, they're able to make them comfortable. It is quite understandable that a Western Australian who has seen a person dying in distressing circumstances might consider this option. But they really have to ask themselves the question, did that person have access to palliative care? Did they have access to specialist palliative care? And was it good palliative care? A bad death because of poorly practiced palliative care, the solution to that isn't a quick lethal injection. The solution to that is let's make sure that they have quality palliative care in the first place. And we don't have that everywhere in Western Australia.
No, we certainly do not. And that's been really exposed, particularly people in the regions, those vulnerable remote communities. This show's called The Front Page, Nick, and the West Australian had an interesting front page. It was on Tuesday this week, and it's pretty clear that that newspaper wants this legislation to go through. There was a Liberal member of Parliament who was front and centre of that story. What I find interesting is there are people in the government who are against it, but they don't seem to get the same coverage.
Well, absolutely not. I mean, there's been some very experienced, high-profile Labor MPs. I'm not going to name them.
I can. Tony Booty.
Yeah. And
Margaret Quirk.
Tony Booty, that's true. But there have been others, including a senator recently who's come out. These people are very experienced.
Pat Dodson.
Yeah, they're very experienced. Well, where's the front page for them?
Yeah. Look, before I let you go, this is now in the upper house. It's being debated. You're pushing for amendments. How do you think things are going to play out?
Look, I expect that there'll be a vote on Tuesday. And then we'll start the clause-by-clause consideration. It's inevitable that the bill will pass the second reading, but there are quite a number of members who have indicated that they are very concerned about the bill and want to see amendments passed, and some have said that they won't support the bill on third reading if the amendments aren't passed. So there's a lot of water to go under this bridge yet, and I expect this will take quite a few weeks.
All right, final question. Queensland, they're looking at it, they're forming a committee. Where do you think they'll go?
Look, all I would say to the Queenslanders, both the people in Queensland and to the parliamentarians, please do the research, look at the wrongful deaths that have happened in the other jurisdictions. As soon as you go down this path, you will guarantee casualties in your own state. And if people want to have this, if they believe that it's possible to create a safe system, they have a duty to identify what is an acceptable casualty rate. In my opinion, the acceptable casualty rate is 0.
Nick Goiran, thanks for joining us tonight.
Thanks.